This is Emily with Clara's Canning, and today we're doing a Whatcom farm tour with Dillon Honcoop. Cooking and canning with my grandma Clara at her little house in Rural City are some of the best memories I have. And now, I'm on a mission to preserve local food systems and traditions. By combining my lifetime of professional culinary and farming experience with generations of knowledge to bring you a fountain of skills and recipes to sustain and pass down. We're getting to the very bottom of food from the ground up, so I hope you'll join us. Today, we're here with Dillon Honcoop of Whatcom Family Farmers, and he's going to take us on a tour around some of the farms that have closed and talk about farm loss in Whatcom County.
It's a real thing. It's happening. Let's go check it out.
Okay. So this is the road you grew up on.
Yeah, and in fact, this is the farm where I grew up, right here, which is no longer a farm. My dad had a crop failure and had to shut it down within the last year or two.
Wow.
So now someone else has taken over the land. They're farming raspberries there like he used to. This here, that's another farm that went out. My neighbors, the Nidums.
Wow.
Had a dairy farm when I was a kid.
So how many farm or dairy farms, I guess, but farms in general were on this road from when you were a kid?
Oh goodness. Dairy farms?
Yeah.
I think 7 or 8.
And how many are there now that are still functioning?
There's one that's still sort of going out here, so
that
it's very small, and I'm not sure how much longer they're gonna do it. There's another farm that was a dairy farm for a long time, farmed with my grandpa, because we just went by my place, which was my grandpa's farm.
Yeah.
So yeah, this whole road was full of small dairies. And that's really mirroring what we see across this whole county.
Yeah.
This county was huge in dairy, and honestly it has almost, not quite as many, but almost the same amount of cows now in much bigger dairies.
Yeah.
This is the dairy that is still dairying here on this road. And I'm not sure how much longer, because I don't think they have a next generation that's gonna
which brings
take
us
it
to
over. Yeah.
the topic.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors. I mean, at least in my family, like generational loss, but divorce and financial issues are the three in my book. I don't know if I'm wrong, but those seem like the three biggest reasons farms close, and and it's because those three factors are so precarious, because there's so much pressure outside of that from development and the margins being shrunk so fast that in my family, my grandparents' generation, everyone prior were farmers for as many generations back as anyone knows, and that goes all the way back to Europe on my mom's side.
Yeah.
And then in one generation, my mom's generation, it's essentially all lost. Not a single one of my cousins or aunts and uncles when I was a kid, there were still farms. I still went to my uncles' and aunts' operations and stayed there in the summer, but as of right now, no one farms the same way that we used to, and that happened in one generation. And not even a whole generation, though.
Yeah. Well, certainly market pressures are huge. This is an interesting spot to me here.
Yes.
There was a dairy farm right here, and now it's all houses. You can't even see any really remnant of the dairy. It's all gone.
And this is something I have talked to elder farmers in the area about, is the encroachment of development.
Yeah.
And one thing that they mentioned, especially that's so wild to me. That's such an interesting place to, not judging, but, and something that because something that's different that I think a lot of folks don't understand outside of farming communities. Farming communities are so close-knit because when you need something like, you know, you can call first responders, but a lot of the things that you need on a farm are not necessarily a first responder call. It's about like your direct neighbors and the relationship you have with them. And there's a lot of sharing, or at least used to be a lot of sharing and a lot of like pulling together to make things happen. And when stuff like that happens, a lot of older farmers feel like no one asked me. And it's interesting because on a completely, you know, bureaucratic sense, it's like, well, no one has to ask you. But in the true sense of farming and community, that is such a hard slap in the face to see. How many generations has your family been here, and how many generations were farming?
Farming the whole time, from what I know from the folks that came across, mostly from the Netherlands, because I'm mostly Dutch. They were farming from the get-go, and my family generally goes back 4 or 5 generations.
In Whatcom County?
Not just in Whatcom County. It kind of depends on the family, but yeah, 3 to 4 generations here locally.
Wow. So what's it like in your position seeing all of the change and farm loss in this county?
It's hard because I remember a time when, you know, areas like this, even a farm like this here, again, one that just closed within the last couple of years, these were all hubs of activity and families that people knew. You'd see them in town, you see them at the fair, you could run down to their place if you needed something. It was a community that was growing food, raising animals. And yeah, there were probably somewhere around 500 or more small family dairies all over this county going back 30, 40 years. And now there are less than 70.
Which is, and again, like you said, there's not necessarily a loss of cows. It's change. It's the restructuring of how those cows are farmed, which, in my personal opinion, you know, I'm pretty crunchy when it comes to farming and farm standards, but those are ideals I hold for myself. I don't necessarily judge other people on the same standard that I would, you know, consider for myself. But
that's where my grandpa grew up, actually, on the banks of the Nooksack River, out at the end of that road. The farm and house and stuff that he grew up in isn't there anymore, but he was actually born out there. Wow. Yeah.
Well, on that farm we passed back there, you're going to have to remind me of his name because I said it. Bronsma. His family had been in that same exact place since 1910.
Yep.
And he's taken us on a drive of this. He knows a lot about the river systems here, and he was, you know, talking about his farm. It closed down, and he doesn't really have a lot of high hopes for it to be resold. And his, you know, he seemed pretty at peace with it returning to nature. And, you know, I appreciated his attitude and his wisdom, but there's also a deep sadness about it. And I think it is hard for people to, it's kind of hard for people to wrap their minds around.
Yeah. Well, and you talked about the different pressures. I mean, certainly market forces are a huge thing, and the price that farmers get for the food that they produce hasn't gone up anywhere close to being commensurate with how much the cost to produce it has gone up. And that is a big reason why you see much bigger farms now, because the only way they can survive is to have the efficiencies of scale.
Yes.
And they are way more efficient, and in some ways they do some things a lot better than you could on a small farm. But it also loses that sense of community that we're talking about.
Yes.
That is also integral to, I think, stewarding the land and growing food. And that's where, on top of those market pressures and all the other financial things, you know, the pressure of development certainly, but also pressure of overregulation. Mm-hmm. When you have regulators who, I think, like you said earlier, don't necessarily have to, you know, ask somebody first if they can do what they're going to do. If you talk about the bureaucracy, But really they should, because in a lot of ways I think the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater. Where, there may be ideas of better ways to steward the land, protect water quality, things like that. But if those are rolled out in a way that make it so a farm can't survive, are we really ahead of where we were? And that's where, if it could be done in a collaborative way, and I know that can be challenging, and farms can also be resistant to change. Yes. But if we can do it in a way that isn't adversarial, and figure out a way to do things better, yet make it still feasible for small family farms to stay in business, that would be the ideal. And that's not really how it's happened.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one big thing, something that I've even seen in my own family, and like, we still get together and we all get together, it is like this big exciting moment, and it feels like no time has gone by. But when I was a kid, and then when my mom was first having her first children and on a farm, and everyone lived next to each other, everyone was together all the time. Yeah. And there wasn't any such thing as needing childcare or
gotta have the dirt bike.
I love the freedom. And I don't think that people consider it as much, but there is, and I noticed that just with my own family, but within farm communities, you can feel the loss of what used to be so collaborative and so close-knit. And now it feels like so many people in farming and otherwise, we're isolated in these strange bubbles that feel so lonely, but everyone's experiencing the same loneliness at the same time, but we're right next door to each other, which is so interesting and hard for me to see. And then the other thing is, I think the biggest thing that people need to consider is saving and preserving the land in whatever way really that needs to happen first. Because once that land is lost, or once water rights are lost, and that farmland can't be farmed, pavement is forever. Once development comes, we're not coming back from that. So I don't think people, like, there's a precipice point that we're standing on here that I would think it would behoove anybody or any type of farmer, from the smallest, crunchiest setup to the biggest, commercial operation, whatever you want to say, to work together in some sense, because I think there are, efficiencies or, community standards and things that we can learn from huge commercial setups and long family ties to farming, especially first generation farmers. And even though I come from such a long line of farmers, I in a lot of ways feel like a first generation farmer, because I was not raised. My mom was on a farm with her first 3 children in her first marriage, but that was lost between her first 3 kids and me and my sister. So, I was on my family farms in the summer from my aunts and uncles, but still, to me, I feel like a first generation farmer. So I think it's appropriate to do, I don't know how to say this, I guess, but it's appropriate, I think, to kind of learn from everybody and everything. And, you don't have to agree with everything that anyone does or says, but it's respectful.
Well, and people who are running big farms have things that small farms can learn from and do, and vice versa.
For sure.
And small farms sometimes can be trying out new ways of doing things that aren't feasible for a larger operation to gamble on and prove that, okay, this practice works and actually does a better job, whether it's increased production or better stewardship of the land, improving soil health. I mean, and it is a cool time. As much as there's a lot of heartache around and loss of farms, there's also a lot of new research and technology and understanding, particularly of the soil, because the soil connects so much of growing food, right?
Yeah.
And just the importance of that, but also the techniques that can be used, and some in ways that don't have to be terribly expensive to build soil health and productivity on a farm. But people also have to be given the space to do that too, and encouraged to do it from the ground up rather than forced to do it from the top down, which often ends up having these unintended consequences of just pushing people out.
Right. I think there's also there's a misconception to some people that if you're a big farm, you automatically don't care.
Right.
And you're automatically doing harmful things. And if you're a small farm, you automatically care. And you automatically are doing all the correct things.
Yep.
And I can tell you from my own experience of working on farms, that's really incorrect. I've seen really terrible management of waste of all kinds on small farms, and I've seen terrible management in big farms, and I've seen really surprisingly conscientious and thoughtful stewardship from big farms, and I've seen the same from small farms.
Yeah. Well, that's why with my advocacy with Save Family Farming and with Whatcom Family Farmers, our deciding factor on what we're promoting and encouraging, it doesn't have to do with a farm size.
No.
It has to do with the spirit of the farm. I mean, really, ultimately, that's the difference between what people talk about as a corporate farm, which thankfully we don't have a lot of that around here yet. Again, these forces that we're talking about can push people in that direction to sell out, and it's a big company with investors that is the only one that can afford to come buy up that space and take over that operation if it survives at all. But a family farm as opposed to that corporate farm, they need to make money to survive, but ultimately their goal isn't just to make a buck, it's to see that farm continue on to the next generation. And that changes everything, because suddenly you have to protect that land. You have to think about the next generation and the generation after that. You have to be sustainable to the core if you're really going to do that.
Well, and like I said, even though I have very crunchy ideals for myself and how I like to do things, the worst possible outcome is the loss of the land and the loss of a family farm, because once it's lost, there is no discussion, there's no evolution, there's no way for people to work together. And that kind of leads into another big issue, especially in Whatcom County. I think it's really major here, is farmland being priced at residential prices, because then if you're pricing 20 acres, a house and a barn in a residential sense, that's extremely expensive. And for us specifically, in my own experience, it's really hard to try and afford something in that. I feel very dedicated to doing that, because it's something I want to do, is preserve some farmland of any kind, regardless of whether we make it a profitable to the market, to the public farm, or if it's purely just to preserve some chunk of farmland. Ooh, hello. Who's this?
Forget whose place this is. Good old Minnie Mo there.
I just assume you know everybody, every house.
I'm not that good.
I don't know. One idea that I really like to push, that I don't, I will say this, I don't outwardly push very often. I keep my page pretty light, because I think a lot of us are already struggling so much with the depth of disparity in the news. But one thing I really like to push is, the fact that we all need each other. And I was raised in Seattle. My dad's side of the family were more artists and designer types, and my mom's side of the family are all straight up farmers from the east, so I have always been from west to east, somewhere in the middle, and I've seen both sides my entire life. And it's interesting. I think more and more lately, I think my family has really kind of, I don't don't know, like melded in a way, or like things have kind of, the distinction between the sides is not as much to me. Maybe it's because I'm an adult, I don't know. But I see a lot of that kind of, it's not east versus west in Whatcom County. It's, you know, but the spirit of the differences are the same to me. And again, I feel like kind of like a kid standing in the middle. I'm like, wait, but what are we, what are we actually fighting over? Are we fighting over stuff? I don't know.
Often it ends up being this rural-urban divide. And here in this community, it's, you know, Bellingham, the urban center to the south, and the North County, where we are, which is much more rural and where the farming happens. And the two sides don't understand each other and could certainly do a lot better getting along. Yes. And supporting healthy policies for everybody if the sides did understand each other better and listen to each other. But, you know, you talk about farmland, protecting farmland. There are different ways to do that. And one of them can be a top-down approach with regulation or zoning, you know, government rules, protecting things, and that does happen. Yeah. And that always needs to be looked at. But one of the things that we always say is the best way to protect farmland is to keep it in farming and to keep it being sustainably and profitably farmed. Yeah. Is if you can farm land and make money at it, people are going to keep doing that. Yeah. And that's going to protect that land better than anything else can. You can have a zoning change or something and say nobody can build houses there, and that's great. But then you end up potentially with an empty piece of property. Right. And well, if it's no longer feasible to actually farm there, is that farmland really protected if it just ends up sitting there? And we know from the stats that farmland that is no longer profitably farmed is as much as 70 times more likely to be developed, even if it isn't zoned as such now. People work away at that, and those kinds of places end up being, you know, moving toward urbanization, not necessarily paved over as a city with high-rises right away, right? But more and more homes coming in, and heading down that road of more pavement and less farmland.
And now that we're talking about percentages, I guess, what percentage of farmers, because there's the precipice point we're standing on is not just with, you know, corporate farming taking over family farming, but farmers aging out without there being a generation to come back in. Yeah. So what percentage of farmers right now are about to retire?
I don't know a percentage, and that's hard to say. Probably the farmers themselves don't even necessarily know.
What's retirement age in farming?
Well, and because every year is like, well, will we make it another year? Okay, we can make it another year. I guess we won't retire. So that's what I mean when I say they don't even necessarily know themselves. Right. But we know farming is the oldest workforce in the country. Average age is over 57 years old for a farmer, and we know that I think it's now up to 40% of farmers are over the age of 65, which a lot of people view as retirement age. Farmers don't necessarily view 65 as retirement age because of this phenomenon. Yeah. But we're also at the same time seeing fewer and fewer young people, or further generations wanting to continue on those farms. So a lot of these farmers, like you're getting at here, are about done, and no one's going to continue it on. Well, maybe somebody will, but then again, maybe their farm may be bought up by that bigger operation down the road or across town. You know, is that a terrible thing? Yes and no. I mean, that small farm goes away and becomes a medium-sized or a large-sized farm. Yeah. And that's unfortunate, but at the same time, at least a farm is still being farmed. Yeah. And there again, it's more nuanced than just big or small, good, bad. It's not a black and white issue. There's so many different shades of gray. And another thing that you were talking about, and I think you've experienced this even in your exposure on social media, there's this perfectionism that can ruin a lot of things, where people have to, with their vision of how somebody else should be doing their thing. And I think that's something that all of us in our social media culture need to cool it a bit and back off and be like, okay, you do you. We can still have standards and ideals. It's not like everything's relative and whatever, but let's encourage people to go in the right way. Let's not demand, though, that they do exactly the same thing that we think that they should be doing or that we're doing, because, again, it's more nuanced, and there may be other factors in play that you don't even know about as a keyboard warrior, what someone is up against to be able to do what they're doing. And again, that can end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater if someone's under attack and their practices are bad. And we've seen it turn into protests. Thankfully not too much locally, but nationally and other places in the state as well. People protest or boycott a farm based on misunderstandings of how they're doing things, or they aren't doing it quite perfectly enough. Well, is that really beneficial if that is used to basically bludgeon somebody out of business as a farm? Some people would say, well, yeah, they're not doing a good job. Well, do you really understand what they're doing? And are they doing a good job or not? Yeah. You have to know quite a bit to be able to judge someone that way. It's the judgy culture, I guess, that can end up being a problem.
Nuance, Dillon. How provocative.
Right.
I was actually, okay, so here's some things that I've learned since, growing up on farms is one thing. Farming for other people is another thing. And then managing your own is a whole nother thing. And then managing all of that experience and a social media presence is a whole another thing removed from those. And initially, I was afraid. I felt this like, oh my gosh, look at all these people and they have it all together. And it's weird because I've been raising chickens for years and years, but I found myself looking at other people's things and being like, oh, mine is not as beautiful and I really can't afford to make it that way. And I can't. And over the years of having my own place and working my own plots and working on social media, I have seen, I've started to kind of, it's good, I guess the exposure was good, but initially I was like, you can never show eggs unless they're perfectly clean and they look so pretty. You can't show your coop if it's not like a beautiful little house, which more recently I'm like, it's very interesting and cute, I guess, that people think chickens live in little houses for people, but they're birds. But lately I've been kind of letting go a lot of that and more so making fun of like, because in my old family albums, if you look through them, the women in my family going out to farm were wearing like leisure pants and silly like scarves on their head and, didn't look all that put together all the time. Coveralls are now in vogue, but back then, which is interesting to me because I've been showing more like, hey, and I've noticed that actually with more farmers. I think a lot of us, when this initially started with like homesteading and farming becoming really popular on social media, everyone was like, okay, we've got to put on our best look. And now I think that perfectionist arc is on its come down, which is probably a good thing because I'm noticing a lot of people kind of letting go and being a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more honest. But I will say this, you do anything honest or do anything a little bit relaxed, someone's going to come in your inbox or comment section and like...
There's always somebody who thinks something is wrong, and that's... Some people... I think some people don't do it from a good place at all. Most people probably do it from a place of wanting good things to happen and the best for every, outcome. Yeah. But if you don't know the whole context and you're just, again, a keyboard warrior, you probably don't know the whole story.
Well, and that's what I was just, that's the interesting part is like, you really have to know something or someone very well inside and out from a lot of different perspectives to really be able to, at least I feel like, have an opinion or, a dissenting opinion. So it's interesting how we put, like, how things have changed, where, again, like, I feel so connected to so many people that I wouldn't know at all otherwise without social media. I've been able to create such good relationships with so many people in this county from all different areas of farming and different areas of food production. And I really, really enjoy the full spectrum of people I've been able to connect with. But at the same time, there's still that kind of like isolating thing where we're still kind of far removed from each other. And it kind of makes that, like, you know, I would love to see more people doing more things, not necessarily in an old style, but just in addition to keeping farmland alive and being farmed, the traditions around farming and how we all used to connect to each other, I think, is extremely important.
Well, and the newer research too, and understanding of things like soil health show in some ways the benefit of some older practices that were discarded, and it's okay to come back to some of that. Again, not something that people should be shamed into doing. Like, for instance, no-till is a very beneficial technique in many circumstances, but not in all circumstances, to improve soil health and how someone is growing food.
I got a little baby tiller, don't tell nobody.
And that's the thing. Someone shouldn't be shamed for doing tillage then, but there are people out there who read articles or hear about how tillage is bad and no-till is good and everyone should be doing it, and then they'll go shame people who aren't doing that immediately after they have read an article. Well, guess what? It can take years to convert a farm to that, and some kinds of farming just aren't amenable to that.
And that reminds me of another point, though, is that, like, for bigger or more conventional farms to absorb and utilize some of these more regenerative and, you know, alternative, if you want to call it that, or old style methods, is there has to be incentive.
Yep.
And there has to be an understanding and a connection.
Yep.
And the reason why I don't judge is, so much of my family farming, you know, everyone prior to 1940 or so was an organic family farm. Yep. But, you know, my family was more conventional farming in their heyday. And the reason why I don't judge is because I understand it was a struggle to make money. And it still is very much these days. Yep. And that's another thing I've learned on the internet that I had no idea was a common understanding, was everyone thinks that just because you're a farmer, you've got it made.
Yeah.
Which, from my perspective, I'm like, well, the amount of farmers who have it made are very few compared. Is that, like, am I wrong? Is that crazy?
Yeah. And almost all the ones that do have it made worked really hard and didn't have it made for a long time to get to that point. Yeah. So this is where my dad grew up. Oh. This is my grandpa's old farm.
It's in pretty. The barn looks all right.
He likes to go around and try to take care of it as much as he can. We want to get out and snoop around and take a look at it. Sure.
Snoop, come on out.
They bought this farm in 1953.
Wow.
He was right out of the military. He had been a drill instructor in the Air Force. And he grew up here locally. And was then, you know, during the Korean conflict, doing the whole Air Force thing, came back home, and what was he going to do? His plan wasn't to farm, but that's what he grew up around and what he knew. So he ended up farming and ended up running this as a dairy farm and slowly morphing it over the years. He bought this place, as he'll say, lock, stock, and barrel with everything that was here, including some cows and tractors and equipment and stuff. But
So did he stay dairy farming the entire time?
Yeah.
Okay.
He dairied for over 40 years, and in 1999 he finally sold the cows. And the calendar is still on the wall in the barn that says, it's a certain day in September, and it says all gone on that day, and that was the last day when all the cows were were gone. Yeah, my dad remembers faintly when he was really little. See the big door up in the haymow? For the old days, and you can see the old workings of the pulley and cable and stuff.
So no
where they would
elevator,
use actual hay hooks and pick up loose hay off of a wagon and pull it up and put it in the barn before the days of hay bales.
Or elevators.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, yeah, and it was so loose hay.
Just loose hay, you're just grabbing it like a claw game.
Yeah,
I wonder.
it's obviously a lot less efficient. This was what was called the old orchard. There used to be a few more trees out here because the original house was right here.
Oh.
And they lived in it for a few years. Apparently it was brutal in the winter because it was just full of, cracks and holes and freezing cold.
So,
and then they built that other house over there in the early 60s.
What year was this farm kind of initially before your...
I don't know. And I'm not even sure if Grandpa knows the entire way back history of what it originally was.
Which is kind of wild because up on our road is so rural, but it's always been farmland since it was, initially logged.
Yeah.
But the families that are up there have been there in place since the late 1800s. So basically there hasn't been much change. But the turnover, again, like I said, this precedent point is now because the kids don't want to, and the kids are grandparents themselves, if not great-grandparents now. So it's kind of wild to see what that change could look like after essentially it never changing prior to now.
Yeah, this is the whole old barnyard in here.
Oh.
It's all just slowly rotting away. You want to sneak in?
That's a nice moss bed. I like that.
Yeah. Let's sneak in here.
So as a kid, was this just like the coolest jungle gym?
Well, there were all cows here, so I wouldn't be doing this.
Wow.
Because I'd be in trouble because I'd be opening things and letting cows out.
Word to the public, if you ever go to a farm, close gates behind you. Wow. Ooh, I see barn cats.
Or maybe rats.
If there was a rat that size, a little frightening, but...
My grandpa, for most of his year, he would make silage, had a little bit of corn. They would harvest it by hand onto the wagon and then run it by hand through a stationary chopper.
Wow.
But for most of his years, he just fed hay.
Wow.
Eastern Washington alfalfa. He would even go over to Eastern Washington to check out the fields. But it was the whole upper part of that barn was chock full before the winter. And then every day you would send bales down these slides to feed.
Wow.
So
in the summer he was obviously pasturing, right?
Yes.
And then, okay. Which one of the main family farms that I grew up on when I was a kid was my Uncle Gerald's alfalfa farm in Quincy, Washington. And my mom would meet him in North Bend, and we got to ride in the back of his semi-truck over the mountains. No seat belts, no problem, just rolling around in the back of the semi-truck the whole time.
Yeah, so this is where all the cows would be milling around in here and eating out of the feeder. This would be full of hay. This is where Grandpa he called it blading. He would use a scraper on his tractor to pull the manure around and fill up. That's a whole small barn in there that he would fill with manure and then scoop it out and spread it on the fields. So
Grandpa sounds like a regenerative farmer.
Yeah. But the other thing that he did was he did an open bedding area. There were no stalls.
Wow.
So this was all just full of a huge amount of sawdust. Obviously you can see a little bit of it left, but it was stacked up in here. It's deep everywhere in here.
Wow. I kind of like
that.
And
so it was an occurrence every day after milking that you would go out and pick pies.
Oh.
Pick the cow pies with a pitchfork, go around with a wheelbarrow, and that's how he would clean all the stalls, all by hand.
Wow.
So
I actually really appreciate the open stall setup. I'm sure the cows liked it.
Yeah. Oh, they for sure did, and he was a big believer in that. But it's also a lot of work.
Yes.
And only really workable on a small scale. You know, he only probably had 30, 40 cows. He was maybe milking 45 or 50 at the most ever. Yeah. From what I understand.
And that I was actually just recently talking about that with Karen Steensma, where she and I were talking about the changes that they've seen in this industry, or dairy, but also farming as a whole in Whatcom County. And she was like fondly reminiscing on the days where people could get by milking 40 cows. Yeah. Which to me sounds like so many cows. Right. But you see these operations now and it's like 1,000 or more. Just
again, efficiency of scale. When they're still getting milk prices that were milk prices years, decades ago, their costs, everyone's costs, I think everybody knows that, inflation, especially the last couple of years, knows that everything costs so much more now than it used to, but you're still only getting the same amount of money for what you're producing.
Well, and how much has, even in the, okay, so like even just from like 2019 to now, like in my own industry and, you know, prepared food, are like from 2020 to 2021 to 2022, which was when I, you know, there was more than one reason, but I put it down for now because I just, between the cost of all of my ingredients, which I'm more than happy to pay. Like, I know that the farmers aren't just raising their prices willy-nilly, but to make food only using local ingredients at the scale that I was allowed to do in a commissary kitchen just didn't work. And a lot of people are like, oh, we miss doing these. And I'm like, I miss it too, but until I can, you know, produce some of my own ingredients as well as have my own space that I'm not paying an hourly rent for, the margins were just completely gone. Yeah. And this work is also a way to like have some type of background income that I don't have to rely on, you know, customers paying higher and higher prices. Right. I have to try and like re-engineer the entire financial system of what I do to make it work.
It's interesting you talk about that 5-year period. For farmers during that time in Washington State, we lost an average for the last 5 years is what you're talking about. We averaged 743 farms lost each year. So in the last 5 years, over 3,000 farms just in Washington State gone.
And you have to think and we're talking about stats, but every single one of those digits is a family's story. It's their history, and there's a massive heartbreak connected to that. Yeah. And it lingers. Like in my family, there's always like, and one of the reasons why I don't know so much about what my grandpa Winston farmed and did is because his loss was so great in my family that you kind of want to like talk about it, but it's this thing where it's like, this is hard, and watching like it's still there and it never really goes. Which, you know, maybe this is a segue into the redemption part of this, or the redemption arc, but you know, I'm never going to farm in the same way that my family did. You know, I'm not going to farm many acres, one crop, everything. It's the same way that I have to do prepared food. It's going to be completely re-engineered to work around all of these pivot points that have been kind of like thrown out these days. But I think there is a lot of answers. Like everybody, and the one thing that is really great about this is that every single person, regardless if you're a farmer or just a citizen or whatever, can play a part in food staying local and the turnaround. And one main thing is, you know, understanding more about this and what farmers are going through and supporting, you know, yes, local, but we can all have a hand in decentralizing our food system by producing whatever amount we can at home. And sourcing. And, you know, there's times I source things locally that, like, yes, it's technically local. Is it the smallest, like, most organic product there is? No. Yeah. But I'm interested in trying to find a way to shorten my supply chain as much as possible. And I think, that's something I really want people to know, is that like we all can play a part in the change. And although it's hard, there's there's a pathway through this. It's just very different. It's going to look very different than what it used to be. So what do you think people in our direct community, but near and far, can do for the situation that most farmers are presented in these days?
Well, I think it's important, like we were talking about earlier, for people to listen before you tell somebody. Doesn't mean that there's no place for that, and we need to have a discussion about what is the best way to do things, and what is the best thing for the future of our community, larger community that we live in here. But listen, understand what's going on, pick up some of the history and appreciate it, even if it's not your thing personally, and be supportive of people. Recognize when they're saying things aren't maybe possible to do because of the pressure that they're under. Realize that that's not just a talking point, that is real. And then, like you're saying, people should get their hands dirty and do what they can of their own, even if it isn't making a dent in the overall food supply and the food system. It's a great connection. I mean, it's good. I think it's good for anybody to do, just to be more aware of where your food comes from. And being involved, being aware, being connected to food as a human.
Well, and so for me, I think about things, one thing that I've repeated a lot, and I will continue to say, is that it's not about a few people doing things absolutely perfectly. It's about as many people as possible taking whatever steps they can. But that takes a great number of us doing that all together for it to really make a difference. And I think that, it can seem silly, but a few pot of herbs on your windowsill, when you remove the plastic that's involved in the packaging that you're buying at the store, and think about all the trucks that had to take it to the store, those all really add up, even in our own lifetimes, even if that's the only thing you can accomplish. I also think even if you have just a little home garden, or you're raising a few chickens, it teaches you so much about the effort and the work that, wow, if I'm struggling in this 40 by 15 plot, if I'm struggling with this, what are people who are managing acres and acres doing? I can't imagine, and for me, a failing row of peas, that meant that this year I didn't have enough peas to save in my freezer for winter, and I had to go out and buy some frozen peas. And that was for me, makes me a little bit sad. But think about that if it happens on an entire farm scale. Right. What does that do for farmers who are, essentially paycheck to paycheck or year to year? So I don't know. I don't know that I have all the answers. I definitely don't, but I think that these conversations are really important. And I think that what you do with Whatcom Family Farmers and, trying to bridge gaps is, at least that's what I see. And that's what I try to do as much as possible. More than anything, educate myself and continue to talk with, all sides in our county, and near and far. But it's my hope that interest, takes more public people, because this is something that I feel more eyes need to be on. The current situation we're in with farming and food systems is really, really precarious. And I think it's starting to become that way. And I think that seeing so many people be interested in homesteading is really excellent. But this is a topic that's very near and dear to me, at least, and I think that it's something, we all need to pay attention to a little bit more and be more involved.
Absolutely.
So.
This was the old manure shed. So he would pile that up with manure. But this would be one of those things that at that time in the 90s, pressure was higher and higher on water quality. He didn't have a lagoon or liquid manure management system to store manure in the winter. So he didn't really have he would have had to totally change how his operation worked and invest a lot of money. He was right at retirement age.
Yeah.
What's he going to do? That's when he closed.
Well, the choice is to survive in retirement or to do something that may or may not pay off.
Yeah. And it was those pressures that were the deciding factor. That's when he shut it down.
Yeah.
Because he just wasn't going to be able to adapt.
And how old was he at that time?
Oh gosh, that was 1999. He was born in 1930, so he was 69 years old.
Yeah, which young for a farmer.
Yeah.
This is interesting. What was this? Well, what are you working on currently? How can people find you? What do you want people to know?
Well, I have my podcast, the Real Food, Real People podcast, where I'm sharing stories of people who are growing food, trying to reestablish that connection that I think is part of the problem.
Yes.
Is that disconnect between people who don't grow food but eat food and those who are growing it. So that's the whole purpose of that. And then I do a lot of advocacy with Whatcom Family Farmers and Save Family Farming. Those are both nonprofit organizations, which just released a new film that people should check out called Losing the Farm, talking about a much more recent farm loss than some of the things that we've been looking at. It's very fresh. It's very raw.
Yeah.
It's an emotional documentary of a local farm family that had to call it quits, and the reasons why. And there are a lot of reasons why, but it gets into the details of some of the water pressures that are happening. Water access for farmers. Farms can't survive without water. Yeah. In some shape or form. Talks about labor and how that's becoming an issue to find people to help, get the farming done. So losingthefarm.com is where that is if people want to check it out. Yeah. As well as Whatcom Family Farmers and Save Family Farming on social media. And of course, again, my podcast, Real Food, Real People. Which I've been on. Yeah. I will link all of those things below. And thank you so much for having us and showing us around. Really appreciate it. Absolutely. And we appreciate your family's history in our county. Thank you. What was that, Greta? You want them to like and subscribe?